Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our July Clear Up the Chaos. I cannot believe how quickly the year is flying by. We are officially more than halfway through, and I hope each of you are enjoying your summer and getting a break from the heat wherever you are. I am thrilled to have several speakers here today. We have Kevin, Emily, and Mitch joining us from Ironwood. Many of you I know on this call are regular attendees, but if this is your first time attending a Clear Up the Chaos, I welcome you. And just as a friendly reminder, as a client of NCW and Sanford and Tatum, you have complimentary access to Ironwood and their team of experts. So I encourage you, if you haven't taken the time yet to complete that agreement, please do so. I will send a follow-up email at the end of this presentation with that information as well, if you haven't done so yet. But I'm going to pass things off to Emily. We have a lot of hot topics that we are going to be visiting this morning on termination considerations, OSHA medical mismanagement, and the latest drug testing troubles that I'm sure will be interesting to hear about. So Emily, I'm going to pass things off to you. And again, I thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us this morning.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. We're happy to be here. Today, I want to discuss the evolving landscape of marijuana legislation and its impact on HR professionals. So the latest drug testing troubles. With new laws, court cases, and cannabis products emerging, crafting effective drug testing policies has become increasingly challenging. Some trends to look out for in 2023 that will potentially impact your company's drug testing policies are, and they're in no particular order, expanded substance testing. So organizations will be expanding the types of substances they're testing for. In addition to traditional drugs such as marijuana or cocaine, organizations will be testing for newer drugs such as fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. This will help to ensure that employees are not using these dangerous drugs and to keep the workplace safe. Another trend to look out for is going to be the use of oral fluid testing. I will get more into this trend a little bit later here, but this is a less invasive version of testing than like urine testing and can detect recent drug use more effectively. It is worth noting that employers will need to wait for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to certify labs capable of processing these tests, as none have been certified yet, but the trend is emerging, so be on the lookout. Another trend to consider is the greater emphasis on employee wellness. So organizations will be placing this emphasis and treating drug addiction as a health issue rather than a disciplinary one. This will involve developing employee assistance programs and offering support to employees who test positive for drugs. Another trend, again, not limited to, is the increase of technology. So in 2023, organizations will be using more advanced technology to improve the accuracy and efficiency of drug testing programs. This may include the use of automated sample collection devices, digital data management systems, or on-site testing devices. And then last but not least that I'm going to hit on is just compliant with state laws, which this isn't changing, but organizations will need to ensure that their drug testing programs are compliant with state laws. Some states have legalized marijuana, and organizations will ensure that they are not violating state laws by testing for marijuana or other drugs that are legal in certain states. So with these trends in mind, for decades, the pre-employment drug test has been one of the most consistent parts of the hiring process. Many jobs demand that applicants submit a drug test before they will provide a concrete job offer.
Anywhere. Wonder if I left this.
So with that being said, even places like grocery stores or retail chains where safety hazards on the job are relatively minor compared to transportation manufacturing, demanding these drug tests is imperative. The variations in state-by-state rules and interpretations of recreational and medical marijuana further complicate matters, with some states legalizing marijuana. Pre-employment screening is declining in states where recreational marijuana is legal. A survey reveals that 7.5% of employers have dropped marijuana testing from pre-employment screenings, and 3% have eliminated all employment drug testing. So does that mean the workplace drug screening is irrelevant today? Hardly, and not just because regulated industries such as transit must screen employees by law. Drug test panels still provide information on other hard drugs, including, again, like cocaine, methamphetamine, other opiates. And although cannabis is broadly accepted medical uses and may have been embraced by recreational use, the same is not true for other substances. So still doing that pre-screening is important. There's also a concerning rise in workplace accidents and injuries involving drug-impaired employees as well. Some companies that stopped drug testing quickly saw an uptick in the rates of workers' compensation claims, accidents, turnover, absenteeism. The number of drug tests performed after an accident that came up positive for marijuana grew 204% from 2012 to 2022, coinciding with the trend of more states legalizing recreational marijuana use. The post-accident positivity rate was 7.3% in 2022, up from 6.7% in 2021. Even among workers in safety-sensitive jobs, post-accident positivity for marijuana jumped from 1.5% in 2018 to 2.1% in 2020. So we obviously see that the states legalizing marijuana, there is a trend headed into 2023. Moreover, some industries are reconsidering their drug use policies to attract applicants who may use recreational marijuana. Research reveals that people in states with legalized recreational marijuana use it 20% more frequently than in other states. All while 7 states have passed laws protecting the employment rights of recreational marijuana, such as Connecticut, Montana, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Nevada, and soon California. Some cities have also passed similar protections, and HR teams need to be aware of testing restrictions that are in place. For example, New York testing is not permitted unless mandated by state or federal law. New Jersey advises evidence-based practices to include behavior and physical signs of impairment, followed by a drug test to verify recent use. Nevada only allows testing for safety-sensitive positions. Montana and Rhode Island protect off-duty use or prevent an employer from using a positive test alone to prove impairment. And this, again, just emphasizes the need for HR professionals to stay informed about the evolving landscape and to navigate this complex environment and develop effective policies understanding state regulations and collaborating with legal teams is a must to ensure compliance. This is especially important to companies with a national footprint, as interpretive variances will cross state lines and not one policy will apply. All that said, this ever-changing marijuana legislation landscape demands that HR professionals remain informed and adaptable. By understanding state laws, collaborating with legal teams, and avoiding common pitfalls, organizations can develop effective drug testing policies that ensure compliance, fairness, and workplace safety. Now I want to shift our focus to another important development in the drug testing arena. The U.S. Department of Transportation, DOT, recently published a rule at the beginning of May of this year, amending its drug testing program for regulated industries to include oral fluid testing as an option. Again, it is worth noting that employers will need to wait for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to certify labs, as none have been certified yet, but again, it's emerging. And this rule provides employers with the choice between urine and oral fluid testing when conducting drug tests. Oral fluid testing involves use of donor saliva and use of donor saliva to detect controlled substances. It offers several advantages over urine or hair follicle tests, including direct observation by a laboratory technician, which minimizes the risk of tampering. Oral fluid tests also have a shorter detection window, allowing for detection of a recent drug use. There are some disadvantages employers might want to consider when deciding whether to add oral fluid tests to their testing policies. For example, again, drugs do not remain in oral fluid as long as they do for urine or hair follicle. So the detection window is shorter. So if you were to have like a hair follicle for marijuana, it could last up to weeks to a month. Also, oral fluid testing is a newer test, so it has not been subjected to some legal scrutiny as urine and hair follicle testing. So just keep that in mind. The rule also addresses situations involving transgender or non-binary individuals and direct observation tests. Employers must conduct oral fluid tests for direct observation collections involving these individuals. Additionally, if a direct observation test is required by a same gender lab technician and they are unavailable, employers are now required to use oral fluid testing in place. Employers have the option to choose either urine or oral fluid tests for all DOT regulated drug tests, such as pre-employment, random, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, follow-up, and return to duty tests. It is important for employers to establish clear protocols and update their drug testing policies accordingly. Employers may want to work with their collection sites to create a standing order detailing what kind of tests should be performed and when. For an example, an employer may want to use urine tests for all return to duty tests and use oral tests for follow-up tests. If employers choose to use oral fluid testing, they may want to update their current DOT testing policies to incorporate the new tests and the new procedures for direct observation tests. And it is important to train your supervisors on this as well. So in summary, the new rule from the DOT grants employers more flexibility in their drug testing programs by introducing this oral fluid testing as an alternative to urine testing. Employers should be careful considering the advantages and limitations of oral fluid testing and when determining the most suitable approach for their organization, which leads me to say that Ironwood would be happy to help you navigate the evolving medical marijuana legislation and drug testing landscapes. I appreciate your attention. I'm going to pass it over to Mitch for some termination considerations.
Thanks, Emily. So we get quite a few calls each month regarding terminations. So we thought it'd be a good idea to cover some of those considerations that are worth keeping in mind when you're separating an employee from the company. We all know Texas is an at-will state, so either the employer or the employee can end the work relationship at any time for any reason or even no reason, provided that isn't an illegal reason. But let's start with resignations. 90% of the time, it's fairly straightforward. The employee will submit their notice, the company agrees to the notice period, employee's final day comes, they get their final check, their COBRA information, you get the company property back, etc. But there are a couple pitfalls you'll want to watch out for. First off, it's always a good idea to look at the reason for resigning. While hopefully it's not common in your company, you should still look through any of the resignation letters you get for any buzzwords or indicators of unaddressed issues. So this could be things like a hostile work environment, harassment, discrimination, wage and hour claims, things like that. Depending on the nature of the circumstances, some employees may not feel comfortable reporting harassment or discriminatory behavior while they're still with the company. And they'll see it as an opportunity to kind of, okay, I'm out the door, I can't be retaliated against, and I'm going to come forward with it. But even if the employee is intending to leave, it's still worth investigating the issues so you can try and get in, address those concerns. Hopefully you can prevent future occurrences of it. Perfect scenario, you can actually retain the employee. So while the employee is in their notice period, you can use that time to conduct your exit interviews to help get more information so you can conduct that thorough investigation and gather feedback for future situations. Failing to act on concerns that are expressed in a resignation letter could potentially have an impact not only on their unemployment claims, but also potentially open the door to further investigations from the EEOC, DOL, etc. So for example, if an employee stated in their resignation that they're leaving due to unpaid wages, you'll definitely want to take a look at it, get those issues investigated and address it before it becomes a wage and hour claim. Another thing you'll want to take the time to consider is whether or not you want to have that employee work a full notice period. It's pretty common in handbooks where you'll request 2 weeks notice, 3 weeks notice. I've seen longer for different positions. But there may be situations where you want to accept that resignation immediately. So if you have a policy requiring that notice period and you accept that resignation immediately without paying out the notice period, it's not only has the short-term effect where in the eyes of the Texas Workforce Commission, they're more likely to see it as a termination, but more long-term, if you make a pattern of, okay, well, you put in your 3-week notice or your 2-week notice, and we're just going to accept it immediately, employees are going to see that. So it'll go from, okay, well, I'll put in my 3-week notice to what's the point? They're just going to let me go. So they'll put in their notice the day before, since they feel like the company's not going to honor their notice period anyway. So while it's fine for one-offs, so situations where, hey, the employee put in their notice, but they're disgruntled, you're worried about them going in and sabotaging things during their notice period, yeah, it might be better to just pull the plug immediately. But if you make a pattern of that, could have some negative blowback. But with that, I kind of want to dive in and spend more time on involuntary terminations. Last year, over 63% of the EEOC charges were related to the discharge of an employee. Whether it's for disciplinary or performance reasons, having that documentation is key in insulating the company and mitigating risk. So even though you can at-will somebody for no reason or for any legal reason, there's still a reason that you're separating the employee. So having the documentation to show that is going to be huge, and it's going to help prevent the employee from coming back and claiming that it was for a legal reason and a wrongful termination. So the first step, and we've covered investigations pretty in depth in the past, but it's always a good idea to have a thorough investigation into any misconduct, particularly if it's going to result in a termination. So not only do you want to make sure that the employees actually violated the policy and that you're substantiating the allegations, but you also want to confirm that the employee knew or should have known that the policy existed. If it's a policy that's never been discussed with anyone and you're trying to enforce it, it's going to be pretty hard to defend it. But if you have a well-written handbook and your employees are signing those acknowledgements, or you're doing refresher training on key policies like harassment and discrimination, it can help mitigate issues long-term because they're going to have a better understanding of the expectations. But if you ever need to defend the termination, you're going to have a lot easier time defending. I had one where it was an unemployment claim where an employee stated they weren't aware that they couldn't round their times on their timesheets. So we had badge scans showing that they'd come in late, could round it to being on time, things like that. There were multiple timesheets that were falsified in this manner. Employee said, hey, I was never trained on it, had no idea that this was a policy. From my end, I could point to multiple training documents, multiple acknowledgements where he's signing off on the policy. And it was a pretty clear-cut one where I really didn't have to put in a lot of work after the fact because we had everything squared away ahead of time. But simply put, if you're conducting a for-cause termination for misconduct, you're going to want to have a summary that shows how that decision was made, what documentation was considered, how you can substantiate that the employee knew what they were doing was wrong. And it's going to be huge if you ever need to bring that back up and defend it. In performance cases, you're going to want to be able to show that the employee was aware of the deficiencies and was afforded the opportunity to try and improve. While you can potentially just say, hey, the employee wasn't working out, it's going to look a lot better if you can pinpoint, hey, these are the metrics we were looking at. They were supposed to make 10 calls a day. They only made 5. We spoke to them multiple times. We implemented a coaching or performance plan that had defined goals and expectations and deadlines so that you could have that clear outline of, hey, this is everything we did leading up to the point of separation. This is how we tried to get them there. Unfortunately, they just couldn't meet it. And that's why we decided to terminate. That's going to look a lot better than just saying, hey, employee was terrible, we didn't want him. Another key thing you're going to want to look at is precedents. This is another area where it's easy to help an employee make a wrongful termination case. So if you've got John Smith over here and he's violated a couple policies, he's been given multiple write-ups, he's still with the company. Then you have Jane Smith who violates the same policies. First incident, she's terminated. It's going to look like there were other undocumented reasons, so discriminatory practices that influence that decision. So if you're not keeping consistent with your internal policies and processes, you're going to just open the door up to a lot more issues down the road. Kind of a key saying is discretion ends up being discriminatory. Even though you may not intend it to be that way, it's always going to look that way if two people are treated differently and you can't articulate why. One of the best decision-making tools I had when I was in the thick of doing employee relations was I kept a document library where I had all my previous investigations, all my disciplinary actions, and all of my terminations. This allowed me to, anytime I had a new investigation or a new termination that I was looking at, I could look back and go, okay, this is how I approached it the last 5, 6, 7 times I encountered it, and make sure that I'm being consistent. Additionally, if it was something that maybe I hadn't encountered before, I could look at similar policy violations or similar circumstances where maybe it's not an exact match, but I could go, okay, I approached this one over here, it was a termination, this one I issued a written final, this one I issued a written final, and kind of look at the totality of the situation, cross-reference past policy approaches, and make sure that I'm being consistent, or as consistent as it could be. Tying in with that, you're going to want to follow your progressive disciplinary process. Ideally, you'll have that outlined in your handbook, so you've got your different steps, your verbal, your written final, prior to the termination. One key factor that the Texas Workforce Commission tends to look at is whether or not the employee was aware their actions could lead to separation. So if you have a policy violation that may not rise to termination on a first offense, you're going to want to make sure that you've issued that written warning prior to termination, because that can be the difference between a desirable outcome and a hit to your premiums. Finally, you're going to want to look at other mitigating factors. And this is where a lot of our calls end up coming in. But if you've got an employee who's out on an active workers' comp claim, maybe they violated a policy, things like that, generally speaking, you want to avoid termination if you can. Or if you do decide to terminate the employee, you're going to want to run it through a legal consultant, just because even if it's not related to the workers' comp claim, it's very easy for the employee to reach out to any one of those lawyers that have their billboards up everywhere, that are just waiting to jump on a workers' comp termination and try to get a payout. So what you'll want to do in those situations, if you do decide, hey, there's some misconduct that we do need to separate for, conduct a thorough investigation, get all your facts together, get all your documentation together, reach out to a legal consultant, and they can walk you through the potential risks and help you try to mitigate those as much as you can. It's not going to be foolproof, but generally speaking, even though you can potentially do it, it's still probably better to err on the side of being safe and hang on to them until the claim's closed. Similarly, with protected leave like FMLA, it can make things more difficult, particularly if you're having attendance issues. I see it a lot with intermittent FMLA where they're cleared for 2 to 3 days off, 2 to 3 times a month. If you're not tracking the reason for those absences, it's going to make it a lot tougher to try and performance manage somebody out for those attendance issues. So you'll want to make absolutely certain that if you are tracking those attendance issues, make sure that you're not factoring in any protected leave such as FMLA into those attendance issues. That doesn't mean they don't have to still follow your call-off procedures and things like that. But generally speaking, it's kind of safer to just say, hey, okay, this is an FMLA absence. We're not going to touch it. We're going to get them on the 5 or 6 times they said their car broke down on the way to work. If there are performance issues, so let's say that they've got some substandard performance, you had them on a performance plan, and then they go out on FMLA or they get injured, they're out on workers' comp, they're on modified duty. Generally speaking, it's more advisable to wait until they're fully cleared, give them a week or 2 to get ramped back up to speed, get settled back in. Then you can restart the performance plan, as opposed to going, okay, well, the deadline was July 11th, but they've been out for the last 2 months. So we're only going to look at 1 month of that performance plan. It's not really fair to the employee, and it's just going to look retaliatory if you decide to terminate as a result. So speaking of retaliation, that's another big one that can make things tricky. If an employee comes forward with a good faith allegation, and then maybe they've had performance issues in the past, or they've had multiple disciplinary issues, and they're making an allegation against their manager, and then you turn around to terminate them immediately afterwards, even if that investigation was ongoing, it's going to look like it was retaliatory. So what you want to do in those situations is try to separate the 2 investigations as much as possible. You know, you're looking into their allegations, you're taking action on those claims. But if you're investigating into the person making the claim, you're going to want to make absolutely sure that everything's done by the book. So your allegations are well substantiated, you're consistent with past practices, you're dotting your I's, crossing your T's, so that you can show that it wasn't retaliatory. So you've made the decision to terminate. From there, you still have some other factors you're going to want to consider. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to have a plan in place for how you're going to conduct that termination. I generally recommend having a script that you can refer back to during the conversation, that we can make sure you're hitting all the necessary points. Throughout that conversation, you're going to want to be empathetic, but at the end of the day, it's not a debate and it's not a negotiation. You've already made the decision. Stand by it, unless some sort of crazy new information comes in that's going to completely overturn your investigation. But ideally, you've done a thorough investigation, so that shouldn't happen. But look at things ahead of time, like if the employee has access to your network remotely, have a plan to disable their access so you can mitigate risks of sabotage, and have a plan to collect or recover any company issued equipment at the time of termination so you can mitigate risk further. If you do try to plan that IT deactivation, make sure that it happens during the meeting or after, not before. We had that happen where the termination was scheduled for one time. The employee ended up calling off that day. Nobody communicated it that the termination date was being moved. So the employee tried to log in on Monday instead of Friday. And his access was shut off and had no idea why. So it turned into a whole bunch of other issues because there wasn't a lot of communication in there. So if you have that plan in place, just be mindful of it, keep monitoring it, be ready to adjust as things develop. Another key thing that I always recommend is try to avoid that walk of shame. Maybe you've seen it where an employee gets terminated midday, you don't time it right, so it's at lunchtime, so all their coworkers are out in the hallway while somebody's walking out carrying their box of possessions. It's going to look bad. The employee's already having a terrible day, emotions are running high. There's a possibility that they could cause a scene. Everybody's going to see it. So if you can try to work around that, whether that's time it for the end of the day when fewer people are in the office, things like that, it'll make things go a lot smoother, and it's going to help minimize the chance of them causing a scene that's going to impact morale or disrupt operations. We had one where an employee got terminated while he was out. Nobody reached out to him. His badge was deactivated. Everything else is going on. They made the notification to the team before telling the employee. So the employee comes in on Monday. Everybody's wondering why he's there. He can't get into the building, so he knows something's off. And it was just a total mess that could have been avoided had there been more of a plan for the actual termination. Another one that not really a consideration, but just kind of a best practice as far as terminations. So employees will have questions anytime somebody's let go. They're going to be curious. They're used to working with this person, and suddenly they don't see him anymore. It's natural for them to say, hey, what did they get let go for? Why'd they leave? Things like that. It's better to err on the side of confidentiality. Don't communicate the reason. Just say, hey, this employee's no longer with the company. Leave it at that. You don't want to start feeding that gossip mill. It's just going to make management look terrible, and it's just going to cause further issues. So now that I've covered resignations and terminations, final piece that I want to touch on briefly are severance agreements. So typically you'll see severance agreements in place where the employee either has access to sensitive company information that you want to try and protect, or the employee is terminated for something beyond their control. Now, it's not limited to those situations, but those are kind of the more common ones. But at the end of the day, as part of a severance agreement, the company is exchanging wages and other benefits for limitations on what actions the employee can take, such as a release from liability, non-disclosures, or other restrictive covenants, so they can't work for a competitor for 6 months, things like that. We've covered these a lot over the last couple months and a lot more in depth. But it's still worth, if you do decide to push forward a severance agreement, it's your first one you're drafting, run it through your legal counsel to make sure that the enforceability is there. There have been some big changes recently. So even if you have an existing agreement, it's still a good idea to get that reviewed. Additionally, there are some additional regulations that come into play if the employee that's being offered severance is over 40. So under the Older Workers Benefit Protection Act, that'll govern things like how it must be communicated, that you need to cover the rights under the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the review and revocation windows, among other factors. So if you are using a severance agreement, if you haven't done this already, it's worth just scaling it through your legal team or your legal consultant. Make sure that they've squared away everything. Make sure you get their legal blessing before you start pushing out a severance agreement to your employees. So I know I've bounced around between a couple of different topics, covered them at a very high level. So I appreciate you hanging in there. When it does come to terminations, keep in mind that these situations are seldom black and white. And while I've covered kind of from a more general standpoint, we'd be happy to jump on a call and talk through any specific scenarios, since each investigation in each case tends to be a little bit different. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kevin, who will be covering some OSHA medical mismanagement.
Thanks, Mitch. So today we're going to talk about medical mismanagement claims and a new thing, not 100% new, but a more recent occurrence of OSHA citing medical mismanagement for some businesses around the country. So it's been a recent move. Basically, OSHA is using what's called the general duty clause to cite businesses for medical mismanagement. So what is medical mismanagement? Basically, it's when employers deny evaluation, care, treatment of injured workers. Even if they have an on-site medical provider or an off-site medical provider. Most of our clients probably on the call don't have on-site medical, they have all off-site. But basically, when you have an employee that's injured, how you're getting them returned back to work? Are you returning back to work too soon? Are you exposing them to re-aggravation of injuries because of the return to work process? So OSHA has pulled the general duty clause, which is the catch-all regulation. If you never have been pulled into an OSHA investigation, we do a lot of them. Basically, there's thousands and thousands of sentences of OSHA regulations, and we can spend hours just on one sentence arguing a regulation with OSHA. Well, when there is not a regulation written for a particular problem or a particular area OSHA is investigating, they go what's called general duty. Well, the general duty clause is covered under 5A1. The 5A1 basically says the employer shall furnish to each employee employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees. So under the general duty clause, there's actually a couple other parts that people tend to gloss over. 5A2 is basically the employer will follow the OSHA standards, but no one ever really addresses 5B. Well, the general duty clause under 5B is each employee shall follow and comply with the OSHA standards and all rules, regulations, and orders issued pursuant to the OSHA Act. So it's not just the employers that have an obligation to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards, it's the employee's obligation to follow the safety standards in their workplace. So we're going to kind of dissect that a little. So the general duty clause, we've seen the general duty clause pulled into a lot of different events over the years. Nothing quite like when COVID hit. There's definitely no regulation that was addressing the COVID pandemic. So OSHA and everything that they cited about employees getting exposed to a COVID employee, becoming sick or having medical issues in the workplace because of COVID exposure, OSHA always referenced the 5A1 regulation when it came to citing businesses. During the summers, and what we see more prevalent now is the heat illness. OSHA does not have a regulation on heat illness, so we see 5A1s pulled in that respect. And the workplace violence. When there's a workplace violent event, an employee's injured, OSHA goes to the 5A1 to cite that. So the reason why we wanted to talk about this section today is managing an employee's injury really speaks to our client base. Our client base, we get a lot of phone calls, and especially in the oil field in the West Texas and the Mexico marketplace, we see a lot of, that mixture of you're really not that hurt, or, just duct tape it, or sometimes like buck up buttercup, just manage your injury, move on. And OSHA is going to be going after, we see that mentality. If you as a business are trying to keep from reporting that injury to workers' comp, you're making yourself susceptible here. So they are a bit rare. I mean, medical mismanagement is very rare, but when you start talking about if you look at from the perspective of a workers' comp claim, are you managing that claim to its fullest? Are you doing what's in the best interest of the employee or in the best interest of the employer? And because we take so many phone calls post-injury, we already know the answer for ourselves, but something for you to answer yourself. We do tend to see there's a tint of how do we protect the business here more than the employee. So it's something to look into. Now, what we see what's triggered most of these medical mismanagement claims have been coming from complaints in the unions. It really started a few years back in the Tyson food industry. Then in April, Amazon was just cited for union complained about ergonomics. OSHA spent good 2 years managing cases on Amazon for ergonomics. And then within the management of cases, they identified the medical mismanagement claims that were coming into play where employees were having ergonomic injuries and not being managed, treated, returned to work in a proper timeline that had the employee whole. So basically the OSHA's list of concerns when it comes to medical mismanagement, there's not enough information given to health professionals. So within our client base, are you managing this injury yourself? You paying out of pocket because you think it's a small dollar claim. We've seen some employers willing to pay up to $5,000 out of pocket for a medical injury for an employee. You know, most of our clients are probably $500, but a $5,000 injury is probably a pretty significant injury. So are you passing along all the necessary medical history and information to the doctors when there is an injury, when you're trying to manage that injury yourself in-house? Incomplete medical records. Are you keeping everything, if you're trying to manage this injury yourself, are you keeping everything that's required? Are you even aware of the OSHA record keeping requirements? But basically, any work-related injury or exposure triggers a 30-year post-employment record keeping guideline. I don't think I've ever met a business that knew they had to keep medical records for 30 years post-employment. Another issue that OSHA has is inadequate tracking and following up employees regarding to joint complaints, ergonomics, muscle complaints. That's really going down that ergonomics pathway. And then inappropriate job accommodations for workers returning back to work. Now, this really strikes home with our client base. What's your light duty process? What's your return to work process? You know, that buck up buttercup process is not appropriate. You've got to have a return to duty or light duty with functionality, job, you know, key expectations. What's the weight limits? What's the ergonomic requirements? Most businesses aren't doing fit for duty examinations or return to duty examinations for an injured employee. So when you have an injury and you have an employee that has a back injury, you can't prove the back injury occurred and you can't prove it's healed. So when you're going through the return to work process for that employee with a back injury that may be just slightly tweaked or maybe substantially hurt, are you doing everything properly? Because you're not a medical professional, I'm guessing. We do have a few in Elizabeth's client base, but majority of you guys aren't and don't have the ability to actually know, is this person good to come back to work? Because you managed that claim off the workers' comp roll because you wanted to not hit your workers' comp. So now you're triggering, are you a medical professional to manage that whole process? So got to be very mindful of our light duty process. So now these cases get real complicated because then you start talking about pre-existing conditions, activities outside of work, some things to kind of think about. You know, aggravation of a pre-existing injury is your injury. This is the one of the common misconceptions. You hire an employee with 4 back injuries. We've actually had this call. Guys had 4 back surgeries, major back surgeries. Wasn't asked. He wasn't asked, are you able to perform the key functions of the job description? Because they didn't write a job description. They didn't know that they needed to put in that you're expected to lift 60 pounds on a regular basis. They didn't know that they could send employees to get a medical fit testing to see that they're cleared to work and lift that kind of weights. So employee, after his 4th back surgery, guess what? He got a 5th one. But this time it's on our client's dime because it was a re-aggravation of injuries. Under OSHA guidelines and most work comp, can't speak work comp, but most work comp, you are owning those aggravated injuries. Now, OSHA has a very interesting exception that we love to try to craft the right narrative to meet. So OSHA has an exception to whether you're considered a work comp or a work-related injury. And the reg says the injury or illness involves signs or symptoms that surface at work, but rest solely from a non-work-related event or exposure that occurs outside the work environment. Now, OSHA, you have to dissect those words. So the key is solely from a non-work-related event or exposure. If you aggravate that employee's fifth back surgery if you aggravate and cause that employee's fifth back surgery, you aggravated it. It wasn't solely. This is the one exception that we lean real heavily for during the COVID pandemic, that employee that got COVID got it at home and not in the work environment. So if they got it at home, the signs and symptoms surfaced at work. So when you're talking about medical mismanagement, that employee's injury, was that an injury that occurred at work, was aggravated at work, or just surfaced at work? So really dissecting and reviewing accidents and doing accident investigations are key. So what's your return to work process? What's your light duty process? What basis are you going to make these claims that this is a work-related injury? What provision has an employer made for the on-site evaluation and treatment? Are you guys, if you have on-site medical providers, how are you treating it? Are you providing first aid to your employees? Are you mandating that you provide first aid to your employees? That kind of triggers some different requirements and obligations to you as an employer. If you are going to try to manage this work comp claim off the workers' comp role, are you following all the requirements? And that's where we highly encourage you lean on our HR team, Mitch, to call and say, well, what do I do? I think he probably gets 5 to 10 calls a day just for these types of situations. If you do have an on-site medical provider, are they qualified? What are their qualifications? If you have an employee, how long can a symptomatic employee continue receiving treatment with an on-site provider before you refer them to a qualified off-site provider? Those are some of the questions that you have to consider when you are trying to avoid these medical mismanagement claims. So what's some defensive strategies? The number one defense and the hardest to prove is a fancy word called affirmative defense. And that's a fancy way of saying employee misconduct. So in these types of instances, did you have policies in place that the employee is obligated to report all injuries, no matter how small? What about near misses? Obligation to report near misses. We find, since we talked about drug testing today, we find a more often than not case where employees are quite aware of the drug testing loses its validity after a certain amount of time. So that near miss all of a sudden becomes an injury about 48 hours later when the drug testing is no longer going to be as valid. So we've seen a number of injuries pop up 48 hours later on near misses. So are you managing your near misses? Are you training employees to recognize your supervisors to recognize work-related symptoms of injuries? Do you have policy requirements to follow? Do you have policies requiring employees to follow the completion of all medical orders and prescriptions given? Believe it or not, a lot of our problems come from the employees saying, I'm tired of being on restrictions, or I'm tired of my own perceived pressure that I need to come back to work and do more than I can. Or that medicine just is keeping me from doing my most important job, which is driving a forklift, and medicine says I can't do it, so I'm gonna stop taking that medicine so I can start driving a forklift. Did you allow that through blind acceptance, lack of policy, intention, the buck up, buttercup mentality in the business, or just putting your head in the sand? You need to close those kinds of gaps. So when it comes to OSHA proving the general duty clause, I wanted to dissect that as kind of one of our defenses. The general duty clause, employer has to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards. Well, the employer, OSHA has to establish with the employer that the employer failed to keep the workplace free from a hazard to which the employees of that employer were exposed. And that hazard was recognized. Now, you saying I'm never going out into my shop so I don't ever see anything doesn't cut it. And your frontline supervisor, even if it's supervisor of the day, watching the guys work out on the job site or work in the back of the shop, that is a member of management under OSHA guidelines. So even though you as a business owner or manager never sees what actually happens on that job site, 99% of the time you have some level of management that does. Even if it's what OSHA calls management of the day, which could be just the hourly employee that's tasked with overseeing everything. So that management of the day becomes a management under OSHA guidelines. And when there is a manager present and sees a hazard, it is no different than you who've never actually ever been out in the shop or out in the field seeing it and recognizing it. So OSHA connects you real quickly as recognizing the hazard because any member of management is present. The hazard was causing or was likely to cause death or serious physical harm. This is one of the common areas I find with business owners and managers, executives. What you think is cause death or serious harm versus OSHA, totally different. The OSHA regs, the whole saying, the OSHA regs are written in blood. There's a reason why the regs are there. A fire extinguisher sitting on the ground and not hanging with a little hook 6 feet above it or 4 feet above it, that from OSHA standards is likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So when you think of it as something as basic as a fire extinguisher sitting on the ground, lifting it up a couple feet is proper. One is considered likely to cause death or serious harm, and the other isn't, is properly mounted. So when you think of what you think is dangerous or not dangerous, reorientate yourself and think of it in the perspective of, if it's not a record-keeping issue at how you're keeping your OSHA logs, or you fail to keep your 30 years of medical records, OSHA is going to interpret it as a serious hazard. And then final, there was a feasible and useful method of correcting the hazard. That one, it's just expensive or it's hard, is usually not a solution. It was manufactured this way. It was not a solution. So the general duty clause, OSHA is really going to put a lot of effort, especially when we talk about medical mismanagement, that you're going to know when an employee is injured. You can't say that you didn't recognize the injury. You're going to know when the employee is struggling and not doing the work as well as you thought they would when they came back from their injury and maybe aren't back to full speed. You're going to know when there's other ways of moving that employee to a job that is either 100% restricted, staying at home, or to a more light duty role that involves less involvement in that injury. So what should we do? Know before the injury how you intend to manage an injury. Are you going to report it to work comp? Are you going to let the work comp doctors handle it? Are you going to pay it out of pocket? And if you're paying it out of pocket, are you now your own medical provider and qualified to determine what that employee needs, when he needs it, when he or she needs to go back to the doctor and seek more treatment? Employers with in-house medical staff should revisit the policies related to diagnosis, treatment, and return to work determinations. Ensure you have policies and training in place for case management and return to work. Evaluate any on-site medical treatment program to make sure it aligns with industry standards. Other things that we should do is look at your action plan. What is your break glass in case of emergency, break glass. What is your plan of action when an employee is hurt? How are you going to manage that from A to Z? And then if you find yourself involved in an OSHA investigation, and all of a sudden they've come at you with a medical access order, it's called an MAO, where they're basically requesting all of your medical information on your employee, what's your plan? And from our perspective, call us first, or call your attorney first and us second. But we need to get legal assistance involved ASAP if that's the case. So, conclusion, I want to kind of talk about some of the couple examples of what occurred in regards to Pilgrim. So the quote from OSHA back in 2016, the citation was failing to make timely medical referrals for workplace injuries. OSHA referred it as quote was from the OSHA officer was referring an employee for medical attention in a timely manner is critical in order to prevent muscular disorders or further injuries. Having employees visit a first aid room for in-house treatment over a course of weeks is unacceptable. So, and then the most recent one was Amazon. And Amazon was basically on April 18th, this was out of New York, involved 10 cases where employee injuries were handled in such a manner that it allegedly caused additional harm or hindered the recovery of employees. And OSHA was fined Amazon $15,000, which was the maximum amount they could fine them for this issue. So guys, I appreciate your time. Just kind of a wrap to what we've discussed today on anything involving OSHA investigations or worker injuries. Obviously, you want to engage your insurance provider for the work comp side, engage Ironwood for helping determine best course of action of returning that employee safely back to work. So Elizabeth, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Kevin, so much. All great information shared today. If you do have questions that you think of after we get off this call, feel free to shoot me an email, or you can go directly to Ironwood's team if you already have an agreement in place. I don't have to be involved. Just a friendly reminder, this does take place the second Tuesday of every month. So we'll be back here in August on, let's see, the 8th, which is crazy. But feel free also, if there's anything that you or your organization is struggling with that you would like to see featured as a hot topic, feel free to shoot me an email as well, and I'd be happy to add that to our itinerary. But again, thank you so much for your time and attending today. I know everyone's time is valuable, and I look forward to seeing each of you in August. Keep enjoying summer. Thanks, guys. Bye.